My name is Harold M. Easton. I am 62 years old, and I smell like soil even on my best days. My hands are the kind of hands that have fixed what was broken 100 times over: drainage ditches in January mud, co-op contracts at midnight, a little boy's future on a cold Thursday afternoon. I am not a dramatic man. I never have been. But I am about to tell you the story of the night I stood on a darkened porch, holding a cup of cold coffee, and heard my wife of 31 years say 5 words that changed everything. I'll bleed his accounts dry. She was laughing when she said it. People around Callaway County, Kentucky knew Marlene Bell the way you know a landmark. She wasn't just a farmer. She was part of the geography itself, born on that land, raised on it, buried her husband on it, and spent the next 30 years turning grief into something that could feed a county. 340 acres of certified organic cropland. A co-op charter with 12 participating farms. A name that meant something at every farmer's market from Paducah to Louisville. I came to work her fields in the spring of 1991. I was 29 years old, degree in agronomy, a used pickup truck, and not a single illusion about how hard this kind of work was going to be. Marlene didn't hire me because I was impressive. She hired me because I showed up on time, asked the right questions, and didn't flinch when she told me the south drainage had been wrong for 6 years and every contractor she'd brought in had made it worse. I spent 4 days walking that field with a level and a notebook before I said a single word about a solution. She watched me from the fence line the whole time. Never interrupted. When I finally came to her with a plan, she read through my notes twice, folded the pages, and said 2 words. Start Monday. That was how we worked for the next 3 decades. No speeches. Just work. Chapter 2, The Woman I Married. Karen came into the picture about a year after I started. She drove out one Sunday afternoon, city shoes and all, to visit her mother, and I happened to be repairing a section of fence along the access road. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. She was charming in the way people are when they're performing charm rather than actually feeling it. But I didn't know that yet. I was 30 years old, and I mistook the flutter in my chest for instinct rather than warning. We married in 1993. Marlene came to the wedding in a blue dress and sensible shoes and danced exactly once with me, a slow Patsy Cline song, and I thought about that dance often over the years. The first decade was fine. Not extraordinary. But workable. Karen had her routines. Her book club. Her sisters visiting on long weekends. I had the farm. We had Chance in '92, Taylor in '97. And then in 2003, Alice, Karen's younger sister, and her husband were killed on I-24 during a November ice storm. 3 cars, a jackknifed semi, and 2 good people gone in under a minute. The other sisters, Cindy and Rita, both made their regrets known from a safe distance. Said they didn't have the room. Said it wasn't the right time. I didn't ask Karen twice. I just drove to the foster placement office, signed the forms, and brought 5-year-old Zach home on a Thursday afternoon. He was sitting in a plastic chair, holding a paper bag with everything he owned. I still think about that bag sometimes. Marlene watched all of it. She didn't say much, she was never the type, but she watched. Chapter 3, What the Co-op Was Really Built On. People think farmers are simple. They are not. Farming is geology and chemistry and meteorology and economics, all happening at the same time, in the same field, with a 20% margin for error on a good year. I was there when the drainage system failed in '98 and we lost the Eastfield, 40 acres of organic corn, drowned in 3 days because a pipe coupling cracked 2 feet underground where no one thought to look. I found it at 2 in the morning with a flashlight and a probe rod. I was there in 2004 when the co-op nearly dissolved over a contract dispute with a regional distributor. I spent 11 days negotiating in a conference room that smelled like bad coffee and bad faith, and I walked out with terms that kept all 12 farms in the charter. There was no plaque on the wall for either of those things. There was no news article. There was just the work, and the land, and Marlene watching from the fence line. Karen never came to the field. Not once in 31 years of marriage. Chapter 4, The Letter That Changed Everything. For years before Marlene passed, we were sitting at her kitchen table in January, the kind of cold that gets into the walls, when she slid a folder across to me without a word of introduction. I updated my documents, she said simply. I opened it. Co-op charter amendments. A revised trustee designation. And a notarized addendum I read 3 times before I fully understood it. My name appeared in a clause I had helped draft years earlier, now significantly expanded. Marlene, I started. She cut me off. Not unkindly. You've been the only reliable person in this operation for 20 years. I'm not going to apologize for recognizing that in writing. I held the folder in both hands. Karen will contest this. Marlene looked at me steadily. Karen doesn't know this version exists. Norman does. The registry in Franklin County does. That's enough. She poured more coffee into both our cups. I've watched my girls long enough to know what they'll do the moment I'm gone. I'm not leaving this land to appetites. I carried that folder home and locked it in the fireproof box behind the winter coats, the box I'd been adding to for the better part of a decade. Deeds. Trust amendments. Proxy records. An email chain between Marlene and her original attorney going back to 2009. Photographs. Receipts. Notarized statements. I never mentioned it to Karen. The night everything shifted was a Friday in October. 3 weeks before Marlene passed. The harvest was in. I'd spent the day reviewing yield reports at the co-op office and came home to find Karen, Cindy, and Rita already settled in around the fire pit out back, wine glasses filled, voices loose. I didn't interrupt. I poured myself a cup of coffee in the kitchen and stepped out onto the side porch, which wraps around far enough that I could hear them clearly without being seen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I just needed some air. She can't last much longer, Cindy was saying. Dr. Parrish said 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then we need to be ready, Rita said. Clipped and precise, even with half a bottle of Chardonnay in her. I've already talked to Dalton. As long as the original will holds, we're looking at a 3-way split. Land. Co-op shares. The house. All of it. Karen swirled her glass and leaned back. Harold's going to make a fuss. Cindy laughed, that high, thin sound she made when she thought something was funnier than it actually was. Let him fuss. What's he going to do? Nothing, Karen said. The word landed flat and certain, like she'd already run the numbers. He's an employee, basically. Always has been. She raised her glass toward her sisters. I'll bleed his accounts dry before he even figures out which courthouse to walk into. To Mom, she said. And to finally collecting what's ours. They drank. The fire popped. I stood on that porch with my coffee going cold and didn't move for a long time. Employee. 31 years. A boy in a plastic chair with a paper bag. A drainage system rebuilt in January mud while Karen was at a spa weekend in Gatlinburg. And I was an employee. I set the mug down on the porch railing without a sound. Went inside. Walked past the living room without a word. Climbed the stairs to the small office I kept locked at the end of the hall. Inside the closet, behind a row of hanging winter coats, sat a fireproof box. I unlocked it. Pulled out a fresh legal pad. Sat down at the desk. 31 years of being the background. Of being the man nobody saw. They were about to see me. I opened the box and started writing. There are people in this world who love loudly, with speeches and gestures and grand declarations. And then there are people like Marlene Bell, who love the way good farmland loves, silently, seasonally, with everything they have, and with a patience that outlasts every storm. Marlene had watched her daughters for 60 years. She had watched Karen's charm and Karen's distance. She had watched Cindy calculate. She had watched Rita follow. She had watched 3 women she had raised look at 340 acres of blood and sacrifice and see only a number to divide. And she had watched Harold. She had watched him walk her south field for 4 days with a notebook before he said a single word. She had watched him drive through a November ice storm to pick up a little boy named Zach who had no one. She had watched him fix, season after season, everything that quietly broke, and tell no one. She knew exactly what would happen when she was gone. So she did what she always did. She got to work. 4 years before her death, Marlene had sat down with her attorney Norman Ellsworth, 69 years old, 41 years of estate law, the particular calm of a man who had seen every kind of family come apart over money, and she had told him exactly what she wanted. Not what was fair. Not what was expected. What was right. The document Norman drew up was a marvel of legal precision. It was a supplement to her original will, not a replacement, but an addendum with a conditional clause buried in Appendix C. The language was specific, deliberate, almost surgical. In the event of demonstrated entitlement behavior, defined as verbal or documented planning to exploit, diminish, or dispossess the designated co-founder of the Bell Organics Co-op, the primary estate assets transfer in full to the successor trustee. The successor trustee was Harold M. Easton. The document was notarized by Rosemary Kinfield, whose commission ran through 2028. It was cross-registered in Franklin County. A backup filing sat in an adjacent registry. And Marlene had done one more thing, quietly, on a Tuesday in September, 8 weeks before her death. She had asked her physician to file a formal competency statement. On record. In writing. Because she knew what her daughters would say. When Norman's assistant had called to confirm the final filing, he had relayed Marlene's exact words. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "I wanted on record that I knew exactly what I was doing." That was Marlene all over. The night after the fire pit, after he had listened to his wife laugh about bleeding his accounts dry, after he had climbed the stairs and opened the fireproof box, Harold noticed something he hadn't put there. An envelope. At the very bottom, underneath everything else. His name on the front, in Marlene's handwriting. Careful. Deliberate. The cursive of a woman who had learned penmanship before keyboards existed. He didn't open it that night. He wasn't ready. Instead, he picked up his phone, placed it on the porch railing at the side of the house, and pressed record. 41 minutes later, he had Karen, Cindy, and Rita in crystal-clear audio, every word, every laugh, every clinking glass, talking beside the fire he had built by hand from fieldstone he'd pulled out of the East Drainage Channel 8 years earlier. "I'll bleed his accounts dry." Karen's voice. Unhurried. Certain. He labeled the file. Locked the box. Went to bed. He slept better than he had in years. Marlene was still alive when the packages started arriving. A slim white box from a jeweler. Italian leather luggage. A monogrammed laptop case. Boots that cost more than his first truck payment. Karen stopped bothering to carry them upstairs before he saw them. She'd leave the boxes stacked by the front door like a statement, receipts tossed on the entry table without a second glance. One evening, Harold picked up one of the receipts. The card number was from an account he didn't recognize. He set the receipt back down exactly where he found it. The next morning, while Karen was at her standing Thursday book club, Harold sat down at his desk and called Carla Odom, a retired paralegal he had known for 15 years, methodical and discreet as stone. He had worked with her on 2 co-op founding documents and trusted her completely. "I need a full asset trace," he said. "Joint accounts, credit inquiries, anything filed in Karen's name in the last 5 years." Carla didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Give me a week," she said. She called back in 4 days. There was a credit card account opened in Karen's name alone 18 months prior. Current balance just under $11,000. And there was a savings account in a bank 3 counties over. Balance, $62,000. Funded by systematic transfers going back nearly 3 years. $62,000. Quiet as a field mouse. Steady as a drip. Harold thanked Carla, documented everything she'd sent, and locked the box again. That evening, Karen came home from what she said was lunch with Cindy and set a new handbag on the kitchen counter. She looked at it with satisfaction. Then she looked at him. "Mother's doing worse," she said. The tone of a weather update. "I know," Harold replied. "I was there Tuesday." Something crossed her face. Not grief. Not guilt. More like mild irritation at being reminded he existed in that part of her world. She picked up the handbag and headed for the stairs. "Try not to make things complicated, Harold," she said over her shoulder. "When the time comes, just let the attorneys handle it." He watched her go. Let the attorneys handle it. He almost felt sorry for Dalton Reeves. Almost, Marlene was shrinking. That's the only word that fits. Not just physically, though that was happening too, her frame folding inward like a harvest gone dry, but in some larger sense, like the space she occupied in the world was being quietly gathered back in. She knew it. She didn't complain about it. Harold drove out to her farmhouse on a Tuesday in late October. He brought a thermos of beef broth and a loaf of sourdough from the bakery on Route 68. The home health aide, Gloria, met him at the door and said Marlene was having a decent morning, alert, sitting up, had eaten some breakfast. That counted as good news at this stage. Marlene was in the high-backed chair by the window when he came in, a wool blanket across her lap, watching the east field through the glass. The field had been cut and tilled for winter. Clean rows running all the way to the treeline. She turned when she heard his boots on the hardwood. "You brought the sourdough," she said. Not a question. "Every time," he replied. They sat together for a while without talking. That was one of the things he had always valued about Marlene. She didn't treat silence like a problem to be solved. A red-tailed hawk was working the fence line along the south edge. After a while, she asked, without turning from the window, "Is the box still where it should be?" "It is." She nodded slowly. "I added something. Before Gloria moved in, when I could still get around. You'll find it at the bottom." "I know," he told her. She looked at him then, directly, with those gray eyes that always seemed to be calculating 3 moves ahead. "Karen came by last week with Dalton Reeves," she said. "She brought him into my living room and had him explain the estate timeline to me like I was confused about my own affairs." Harold's jaw tightened. "What did you do?" The corner of Marlene's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "I listened to every word. Then I told them I was tired and asked them to leave." She looked back at the field. Gloria showed them out. Karen didn't say goodbye. Harold set his mug down beside hers. "Marlene, if you want me to." "I don't want you to do anything yet," she said firmly. "Let them think it's going the way they expect. That's important." She reached over and touched the back of his hand once, briefly, the way she might check the temperature of soil. "Norman has everything he needs. Leonard in the adjacent filing has the backup. The only thing left is waiting." She paused. Then added quietly. "And making sure Zach knows he's provided for." That landed harder than Harold expected. He looked at her. "He's in the amended co-op charter," Marlene went on. "Not by name, by designation. The agronomist of record, which will be him once you formalize it. I had Norman write it that way on purpose. Clean and unchallengeable." She picked up her mug. That boy drove me to 4 doctor's appointments last spring. Did he tell you that? He hadn't. Harold made a mental note to talk to Zach, though he already knew what Zach would say. That it was no big deal. That she needed a ride. That it wasn't worth mentioning. Harold stayed 2 hours. They talked about the Hawk. About the drainage improvements on the North Quadrant. About a co-op member named Dale Hutchkins who was thinking of retiring. Ordinary things. Real things. When Harold stood to go, Marlene looked up at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not soft exactly. But settled. You never asked for anything, she said. In 30 years. I didn't need to, he answered. The work was enough. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had suspected for a long time. Harold picked up his coat, walked to the door, and let himself out into the cold gray afternoon. On the drive home, he called Norman's office. Norman, I need to confirm the Franklin County filing is properly cross-referenced with the co-op charter amendment. It is, Norman answered without hesitation. Triple-checked it myself last month, at Marlene's request. Every document points to the same conclusion. A brief pause. And if they try to contest on grounds of diminished capacity, her physician filed a competency statement in September. Marlene insisted on it. She said, and I'm quoting directly, I wanted on record that I knew exactly what I was doing. Harold exhaled through his nose and watched the county road unspool ahead of him. Bare trees. Gray sky. The kind of November afternoon that looks like the whole world is holding its breath. Thank you, Norman. Harold. His voice was unhurried but precise. Whatever happens next, you have a very solid foundation. Marlene Bell died on a Tuesday morning in early November, quietly, the way she had done most things. Gloria called Harold at 6:43. He was already dressed. He drove out to the farmhouse before Karen was awake, stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, and said goodbye in the way he had been practicing in his head for months, silently, with his hand on the door frame and the gray morning light coming through the curtains. He made the calls that needed making. The funeral home. Norman's office. The co-op's administrative coordinator, Bev, who had worked with Marlene for 18 years and took the news in silence before thanking him and hanging up. Karen arrived at 9:30 with Cindy and Rita. She cried in the driveway. Loudly. Briefly. Then walked into the house and began assessing the furniture. At the funeral 4 days later, Karen wore designer black and worked the room near the flower arrangements with the focused energy of someone running for office. At one point, Harold heard her tell the pastor's wife that her mother had been her closest confidant and that she planned to honor her legacy with everything she had. The pastor's wife nodded politely. She'd known Marlene well enough to parse that. Zach sat with Taylor and Harold near the back. He didn't perform grief. He just sat there with his hands folded and his jaw set, absorbing it the way he had learned to absorb hard things, completely, without theater. At one point, he leaned toward Harold and said in a low voice. She knew, didn't she? Everything she was doing, she knew exactly why. She did, Harold told him. Zach nodded and looked back at the front of the church. That night, alone again on the side porch, Harold sat in the dark with the cold settling around him and listened to the fire pit for the second time. Prosecco this time, not Chardonnay. Karen was talking about wood flooring for a farmhouse renovation, the aesthetic, the timeline, the budget that wasn't hers yet. Dalton called this afternoon, Rita said. He says everything looks clean. Three-way split, land included, exactly like the original. Karen swirled her glass. He also mentioned Harold could theoretically claim spousal interest in the co-op shares. He mentioned it, Rita admitted. He said it was manageable. It's nothing, Karen said flatly. Harold's name isn't on the estate filing. He's been drawing an agronomist's salary for 30 years, and he thinks that entitles him to half of everything my mother built. She shook her head, the firelight catching the angles of her face. I'll run every joint account dry before he gets a foothold. Cindy raised her glass. What about Zach? Rita asked. The pause before Karen's answer was longer. Something shifted in her posture. Zach, she said slowly, is not our concern. He's not a Bell. He was never legally part of this family. Whatever Harold wants to do for him, that's Harold's private business. Cindy said nothing. Rita said nothing. Even the fire seemed to go quieter for a moment. Harold set his phone down on the armrest and looked up at the sky. Cold and clear. Stars sharper than usual. Zach was 27 years old. He had been with them since he was 5. He had sat at that same fire pit 100 times on summer evenings, learning to whittle, learning to read planting charts, learning how to be a person in the world. He had his mother's eyes and his grandmother's patience, and absolutely no idea that the woman who had shared a roof with him for 22 years had just called him someone else's private business. Harold checked the recording level on his phone. Then a text arrived from Norman's assistant. Per Mr. Ellsworth's instruction, Mr. Easton speaks after the primary reading. Water will be at the table. Harold typed back, thank you. We'll be ready. Across the yard, Karen was refilling her glass and talking about what kind of wood flooring looked best in a farmhouse renovation. Thursday's going to be a good day, she said lightly. She had no idea how righteous. 2 days before Thursday, Dalton Reeves reviewed every document he believed existed. He was 39 years old, polished, confident. He had handled estate disputes for 12 years. He thought he understood the situation completely. He did not. At 11:17 on Tuesday night, he sent Harold an email. Subject line, Estate Matter, Urgent Clarification Needed. 4 sentences. He had encountered an unexpected designation in the estate supplement. He wanted to understand Harold's role in the Bell estate. He was requesting clarification before the Thursday reading. He would appreciate a response at Harold's earliest convenience. Harold read it twice. Set his phone face down on the desk. Went to bed. In the morning, he drafted a reply. 3 sentences. He acknowledged Dalton's message. Confirmed he was aware of the relevant documents. And attached 3 files. The amended co-op charter, with his co-founder designation. The notarized trustee supplement. And the Franklin County Registry confirmation, stamped and dated. No explanation. No apology. No offer to discuss. Dalton called within 20 minutes. Harold let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 6 minutes long. Covered in polished legal language. Approximately 5 different ways of asking the same question. Who are you, and how did this happen? He mentioned that the document appeared legitimate. He mentioned that the notary stamp was valid. He mentioned, with what Harold recognized as carefully managed alarm, that the conditional clause had very specific trigger language, and he needed to understand whether that language applied to the current situation. Harold transcribed the key phrases into his notepad. Added it to the fireproof box. And drove to Norman's office. Norman had coffee ready. 69 years old. 41 years of estate law. The particular calm of a man who had seen every kind of family come apart over money and was no longer surprised by any of it. They went through the Thursday agenda one final time. The primary reading would cover the personal bequests first, the small symbolic items Marlene had designated for her daughters. Then the estate assets. Then Norman would introduce the supplement. Harold would speak after the supplement was read. Dalton's going to challenge the conditional clause, Harold said. Norman nodded without concern. He'll try. The clause is airtight. The trigger language was witnessed, notarized, and cross-referenced to the audio documentation you filed with me last month. He folded his hands on the desk. He has no footing. And the co-op charter? Your name has been on that charter since 1993. Co-founder designation. Active and uninterrupted. Norman looked at him steadily. It predates the marriage. It predates the estate filing. It predates everything Karen thinks she owns. That document alone answers Dalton's question about who you are. Harold drove home through the gray November morning and sat in his truck in the driveway. Karen was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, scrolling through interior design sites. She'd been doing this more frequently, planning renovations to a house she didn't own yet, decorating a life she hadn't inherited. She glanced up briefly when he came in. Norman's office, she said. Routine, he replied. Dalton called me this morning. He said there might be a minor document issue to sort out before Thursday. Something clerical. She said it lightly. He said not to worry about it. Harold drank his coffee by the window. Outside, the bare trees along the property line stood absolutely still. No wind. The sky was the color of old pewter. Good advice, he said. The conference room at Norman's office smelled like old paper and central heating, and the particular tension that fills a space when everyone present knows the outcome is going to hurt at least some of them. Karen arrived first. Black wool. The new necklace. Cindy and Rita behind her like a formation. They took the 3 chairs on the left side of the table. Dalton came in 30 seconds later, set his leather folio on the table, and did not look at Harold when Harold walked in and took the chair at the far end. Harold was the last one seated. He had timed it that way. Norman opened without ceremony. Confirmed the document, confirmed the date, confirmed the presence of all relevant parties. Then he began. The personal bequests came first. Karen received Marlene's pearl brooch, the one her father had given Marlene on their 20th anniversary. Cindy received a cedar hope chest from the upstairs bedroom. Rita received the hand-quilted blanket from the sitting room. Karen's expression when the brooch was named was a masterclass in poorly concealed disappointment. She had been expecting the lead item in a much larger list. Her eyes moved to Dalton. He gave her a small, controlled nod that said, "Wait." Norman turned the page. The Bell Estate's primary assets, he said, including the farmland, co-op voting shares, equipment holdings, and residual operating accounts, are addressed in the estate supplement dated June 3 of this year. He removed a document from the folder and set it flat on the table. This supplement supersedes the asset distribution provisions of the original will under the conditions specified in Appendix C. Karen sat forward. What supplement? Norman didn't pause. Appendix C establishes a conditional clause in the event of demonstrated entitlement behavior, defined as verbal or documented planning to exploit, diminish or dispossess the designated co-founder of the Bell Organics Co-op. Under those conditions, the primary estate assets transfer in full to the successor trustee. He looked up. That trustee is Harold M. Easton. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Karen's voice came out sharp and high. That is not valid. That document does not exist. It was filed June 3, Norman said evenly. Notarized by Rosemary Kinfield, whose commission is valid through 2028, and cross-registered in Franklin County. I have the registry confirmation here. He placed a second document on the table. Dalton leaned forward. His earlier composure was fracturing at the edges. He pulled the supplement toward him and read it quickly, his finger moving down the page. His color changed. He looked up at Harold for the first time since Harold had walked in. I don't understand, he said slowly, and Harold could hear in his voice that he genuinely meant it. Who is he? What is his standing in this estate? Harold reached into his coat. Pulled out the yellow legal pad. Sat it on the table. On top of it lay a single document, the original Bell Organics Co-op Charter. Signed in 1993. 2 names on the founding line. Marlene A. Bell. Harold M. Easton. I'm the co-founder, Harold said. I've been the co-founder for 31 years. And I'm the man your client called an employee at a fire pit 3 weeks ago. He slid his phone across the table to Norman, who plugged it into the small speaker on the credenza. Karen's voice filled the room. Clear. Unhurried. Certain. I'll run every joint account dry before he gets a foothold. Karen went still. Cindy looked at the table. Rita's mouth opened, and then closed. Norman stopped the recording and removed it from the speaker. The conditional clause, he continued, has been activated by the documented evidence submitted in advance of this reading. All primary estate assets transfer to Harold M. Easton as successor trustee, effective today. Karen stood up so fast her chair rolled back and hit the wall. This is manipulation. This is elder abuse. She was not in her right mind when she signed this. Norman reached for a third document. Her physician filed a competency statement in September, 8 weeks before her death. Marlene requested it herself. He placed it on the table. She was, in her physician's professional assessment, entirely lucid and fully capable of legal decision-making at the time of signing. Dalton sat back in his chair. He looked like a man who had walked confidently into a room and found the floor missing. Karen turned to Harold. Her voice had dropped to something low and unsteady. You did this behind my back. You manipulated a dying woman. Harold looked at her without raising his voice. I showed up, he said. Every time. For 31 years, I showed up. You want to know who manipulated whom? Look at your credit card statements from the past 18 months. Look at the account in the bank 3 counties over. He let that land. I have copies of both. The room went very quiet. Dalton closed his folio. His next client was going to need a stronger case than this one, but the drive from Norman's office was 11 minutes. Harold counted them. Not intentionally, just the way your mind finds small things to hold on to when larger ones are still settling. Karen didn't come home that night. She went to Cindy's, which Harold learned from a text she sent at 6:15. Staying with Cindy. Need space. He read it once and set his phone down. Taylor came over at 7. She let herself in with her key, found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the co-op field reports he'd been meaning to review for 2 days, and sat across from him without taking off her coat. Chance called me, she said. I figured he would. She was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table. He's furious. He said you manipulated Grandma Marlene, that you worked the situation behind everyone's backs. A pause. He said some other things, too. I'm not going to repeat them. Harold looked at his daughter, 28 years old, with Marlene's gray eyes and a habit of measuring everything twice before she spoke. What do you think? He asked. She met his eyes steadily. I think I haven't seen Mom at that farmhouse in 3 years. I think Grandma Marlene called me last January and asked how Zach was doing before she asked about anyone else. Taylor pulled her coat tighter. I think I watched you cook every holiday dinner for the last decade while Mom planned what she was going to spend. She shook her head. I don't think you manipulated anybody. They sat together for a while after that. Harold made more coffee. Taylor looked through the field reports with him. She'd grown up on this land and knew it the way she knew her own handwriting. They talked about spring planting schedules and co-op contracts and the ordinary machinery of work that was still there regardless of what the day had held. At 9 o'clock, Zach knocked on the back door. He came in and poured himself coffee and sat with them. Nobody needed a debrief. The 3 of them just sat at the kitchen table while the night pressed against the windows. And that was enough. The next morning, Harold called Chance directly. He picked up on the 4th ring, already loaded. You had no right. I had every right, Harold replied, keeping his voice level. My name has been on that co-op charter since before you were born. Your grandmother made a legal decision with full competency and full documentation. If you want to contest that, you'll need a lawyer and a very different set of facts. She was sick. You took advantage. Chance. Harold's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. The last time you visited your grandmother was 14 months ago. I was there every week. I drove her to appointments. I fixed what broke. I showed up when showing up was inconvenient. A pause. Don't lecture me about taking advantage. Silence on the line, long enough to mean something. Your mother is going to face legal consequences for the financial activity in her joint accounts. That's not something I'm doing to her. That's something she did. Harold exhaled. When you're ready to talk about where we go from here as a family, I'm available. But I'm not going to apologize for what your grandmother decided. Chance hung up without responding. Harold set the phone down and went back to his field reports. 3 days later, the completed financial audit arrived. 47 pages. Every unauthorized transfer documented, dated, and sourced. The hidden account. The credit card activity. The pattern of small withdrawals over 26 months, totaling just under $61,000. Harold handed it to family law attorney Greta Hollis, who reviewed it the same afternoon. This is civil and potentially criminal territory, she told him plainly. Marital asset concealment. We file for divorce. We attach the audit. We let the numbers do what numbers do. Harold authorized her to proceed. Rita called that evening. Not Karen. Not Cindy. Rita, the youngest of the three, who sounded tired and careful and genuinely troubled. I want you to know I didn't know about the accounts. I knew about the plan to contest the will. I didn't know Karen had been moving money. I believe you, Harold said. And he did. Is there any version of this where things don't get completely destroyed? He thought about that honestly before answering. For you and Cindy? Probably, yes. For Karen, she's the one who made the choices she made. That has a cost. Rita was quiet for a moment. She's my sister. I know, Harold said. And she's been my wife for 31 years. That doesn't change what she did. He heard her exhale. They said goodbye and hung up. Harold sat in his office for a while after that, listening to the house. It was quiet in a different way than before. Not the quiet of a life being managed around someone else's noise, but the quiet of a space that was genuinely still. The divorce was finalized in late spring, which felt appropriate. Things ending as other things were beginning. Greta Hollis was as efficient as advertised. The hidden account was ordered repaid to marital assets. The credit card balances were assigned to Karen. The co-op assets, already protected by estate designation, were untouchable. Karen kept the house furniture. She moved to a condo in a town 40 minutes north, near where Cindy lived. Harold heard through Taylor that she had gotten a part-time position at a property management company. He didn't ask for more details than that. Chance took 4 months to come around. It wasn't a dramatic conversion. No big speech. No formal apology. He just showed up at the farm on a Sunday in March, watched Zach and Harold work on the north field drainage for 2 hours without saying much, and then helped them finish the section they were on. They ate sandwiches on the tailgate. Chance asked about the spring contracts. That was how it started. Taylor had never left. She was at the farm 2 or 3 evenings a week, reviewing soil reports and helping with co-op correspondence, learning the financial structure that would eventually be hers to manage. She had Marlene's methodical mind and was already better at the administrative side of things than Harold had ever been. In February, Zach was formally designated agronomist of record per the co-op charter amendment. He came into Harold's office. Signed the paperwork. Shook his hand. Went back to the field. That was Zach.in April. Harold announced the establishment of the Alice Easton Memorial Agricultural Scholarship, funded by 30% of the first year's estate distributions, designated for students pursuing degrees in agronomy or sustainable farming from Callaway County. Norman handled the legal structure. Zach attended the announcement at the co-op meeting and sat in the back row with his arms folded and his jaw set and his eyes very bright. Harold didn't make a speech. He just introduced the scholarship, explained the funding, thanked the co-op members for their patience, and that was all. Afterward, as people filed out into the spring afternoon, Zach found him near the door. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, that was the right thing. Harold nodded once. It always was, he said. In May, Harold opened Marlene's letter one final time. He was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, his farmhouse, now, legally and completely, in the early morning before the workday started. He had read it a dozen times by then and knew most of it by heart. But he read it again anyway, slowly, in the good light. You never needed my approval, Harold. But for what it's worth, you had it. Every year, every season, every time you showed up when nobody else did. This land should be in hands that understand it. I'm trusting you to keep it that way. He folded it carefully. Slid it back into the envelope. And put it in his jacket pocket. The east field was greening up. The drainage system he had rebuilt 26 years ago was holding perfectly. The hawk, or a hawk, maybe a different one, maybe the same, was working the fence line along the south edge, exactly where it had been the last time he'd sat in Marlene's kitchen. The land didn't know what the winter had cost. It just kept doing what land does, turning, opening, offering the next season to whoever was willing to work it. Harold was willing. He pulled on his boots and went to meet Zach in the field. Harold Easton will never be famous. His name will never trend. No one will make a movie about the South Drainage Channel he rebuilt in January mud. No one will interview him about the Thursday he sat at a table and watched 31 years of quiet work speak louder than anyone in that room expected. But somewhere in Callaway County, Kentucky, there is a farmhouse with a hawk on the fence line and a young man named Zach who knows that someone, two people, showed up for him when they didn't have to. That is what this story is about. Not revenge. Not inheritance. Not winning. Marlene didn't need to make speeches. She needed to keep records and trust the right person. Harold didn't need to argue. He needed to document, be patient, and let the truth arrive on schedule. Zach didn't need to fight for his place in the family. He just needed to drive an old woman to 4 doctor's appointments in the spring and let that be enough. The lesson is this. Character is not what you claim about yourself at a fire pit with a glass of wine. Character is what other people file on your behalf, in writing, with a notary stamp, because you never thought to ask. Be the kind of person Marlene would have put in the box.